Welcome to this Research in Practice event held on the 6th of April 2022. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional lands of the Bunurong people. I extend respect to elders past, present and emerging as the custodians and knowledge holders for this place. I acknowledge that the custodianship for land, seas, skies, waterways and all systems that embody country reciprocally nurtured by local peoples here for millennia. I'm Jacqueline Baker, your host, and today's speaker is researcher Linus Tan, who is joining us from Design Factory, Melbourne. Linus arrived in Australia in 2008 after completing 2 years of mandatory national service in Singapore, which is his home country. Taking up an offer to study at Swinburne University of Technology, he completed a Bachelor of Environments in 2010 and then a Master of Architecture in 2012. During this time, he took an opportunity to go on a master's exchange program to Delft University in the Netherlands, which he really enjoyed. After graduating, Linus taught at Melbourne University for a couple of years, focusing on digital design projects and design cognition, and then going on to run the fabrication lab in 2015. In 2017, Linus took a year off to start a design consultancy before embarking on a 3-year PhD in 2018. I don't really know anyone else that's actually finished their PhD in 3 years, so I find that quite impressive. Linus currently works at Design Factory Melbourne as an innovation coach, which sits between academia and industry, helping the two parties to innovate. This presentation focuses on Linus's PhD study on team behaviours in architectural practices. Afterward, there'll be an opportunity to discuss the presentation as well as the challenges and opportunities that come with managing teams in practices. Over to you, Linus.
Thank you for the lovely introduction.
You're welcome.
All right, I will go switch to, okay, everyone can see the first screen. Just need to move this out of the way. Yep. So thank you again for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us today, especially during lunchtime. So my name is Linus. As Jacqueline said, today I'll be talking about Is Your Architecture Team Effective? A research on teams in architecture practice. So I'll start the presentation talking a little bit about who am I. I won't go too detailed because Jacqueline has did an amazing job already. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research position that I took during the PhD itself, and then the research about architecture practice, which is what I am passionate about. And then I'm going to cover 2 research projects that I did during the PhD itself, and then just finish it off with the next steps. Just before I start, I also like to pay an acknowledgement of country. So I respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne's Australian campuses are located in Melbourne's east and outer west, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So starting off, who am I, where I came from, as Jacqueline mentioned, I did the Masters of Architecture and a Bachelor of Environment from the University of Melbourne. And I love this photo because I think some of you might see this building a lot more familiar as Melbourne School of Design than the current one now. I went to Delft University to do half a year of exchange, which was great. Always a good opportunity to learn architecture from outside Australia. And then went back to do to teach for 2 years as a design tutor at Melbourne University, and then 2 years doing managing and coordinating the fabrication lab. So the 3D printing, laser cutting, CNC routing processes at the faculty. And I went to Swinburne University to do my PhD. And I also taught in design studios and also in design practice. And after I finished the PhD, I'm now an innovation coach and strategist at Design Factory Melbourne. So Design Factory Melbourne is a change agent at Swinburne University of Technology, and our expertise is to create the conditions for innovation. I know this one sounds somewhat vague, but essentially what we do is we build world-class programs to create responsible global innovators. We work collaboratively on challenges beyond the scope of single disciplines So for example, working with scientists from chemistry, working with scientists from Space Institute as well.
Linus, I might just quickly ask everyone to mute. I think somebody might accidentally not be muted, and thank you, all good.
Okay. Yep. So the other part about Design Factory is we are a knowledge network to create impact collectively. We don't operate alone, we operate as a group. And we continue to contribute to the Swinburne innovation pipeline at early stage to experiment, mitigate risks, upskill, and advance projects. So aside from providing services, innovation services to our business clients, we also help the university do or chart out the innovation strategies to for the next 5 years itself. And we also work as a researcher group. So we do produce research mostly on co-creation and innovation processes. There are more than 37 right now, 37 design factories around the world. And Design Factory Melbourne is the third around the world as well. It was established about 10 years ago. And it first came about in Aalto University, and then it came spread all over the world. But aside from working at Design Factory Melbourne, what else do I do? As Jacqueline said, I was doing a design consultancy. So this design consultancy, I help design firms research and do research and development. So for example, working on the South Bank by Beulah competition brief research back in 2018. I also do research writing for companies. So the latest one being Beulah International for their labs division. And also looking at research communications. So one example is the current, what we're doing right now, which is research communication. But at the same time, providing talks about research regarding tested knowledge, design, competitive strategy, architecture practice, and teams. And on that point about research, what am I actually really curious about? I really want to know, how do reflecting and learning contribute to the performance of architectural teams? And that is actually the overarching research question for my PhD thesis. So my PhD thesis, I've uploaded it onto my website, which is www.linustan.com/phd-thesis, where anyone can read. And I hope people do get something valuable from reading it, from the research itself. And just to make it more accessible, I've broken it down into different chapters. So the usual with PhDs, you have your theoretical part, which is the literature review about team learning behaviors. The theoretical review, which is looking closely at Donald Schoen's reflective practitioner. But if for those of you who are not keen or not interested in the theory side, you can jump straight into the studies. So I did the first study, which is the case study on architectural competitions. What I was wondering is, do you pick a design or do you pick a design team? And the question I was investigating was the role of reflective practice and team learning in architecture competitions. And then a second study, which was looking at high-performing architectural teams. So again, the role of team learning and reflection. And then the third study, which I did, was an intervention research. So I was guiding team reflections in architectural teams with the aim of using workshop methods to improve their team performance. And if that's still quite a lot of things to read, you can jump straight into the key takeaways, which is the thesis discussion and conclusion PDF. It distills the research findings into actionable points for design practitioners and provide recommendations for how architecture practice can build on this research. So with the whole PhD itself and all the different studies, the case study, the survey, and the intervention, what I'll be focusing on today is just the survey and the intervention part, because the case study was quite specific to an architectural competition back in 2018, which I understand that not all architecture practice participates in competitions. So I'll just focus on the survey findings and the intervention findings as well. So a bit of the background, I won't go into too much details. I was looking at reflective practice, which covers design and learning. I was looking at design collaboration, which looks at design and team dynamics, which is why triangulating those, what I'm looking at is right here between design, learning, and team dynamics. So not just looking from a design perspective, but also looking from an organizational behavior and organizational learning perspective. So the survey itself about role of team learning and reflection. Do team learning behaviors contribute to the performance of architecture teams? And how do architects facilitate team learning behavior with their teams? So this was the survey that I conducted back in 2019 and 2020. And in this particular survey, I had two steps. One was a questionnaire to measure the standards of team learning behavior and team performance overall in Victoria, Australia, the architecture firms. And then I also did some interviews to find out existing practices that fosters team learning behavior in architecture firms. So this was like just before COVID started going up and everybody going back home. So I was really lucky to just sneak in those interviews in person before we went into lockdown. The questionnaire constructs, first one was about team learning behavior. And this is from the organizational learning perspective, such as sharing within this category itself. There's three constructs, which is sharing ideas, co-constructing ideas, and constructive conflicts. So I'll give a quick example. Sharing ideas is whether you feel safe to share your idea about a particular design of a space, and so will I. Co-constructing is when both of us collaboratively come up with an idea for a design space. And constructive conflict, this is where we argue, but we argue for the good of the design. We argue to understand our different perspectives and to incorporate it into the design itself, because not all conflicts are bad. Aside from these three team learning behaviors, there's also another category in organizational learning, which is fostering team learning, such as task learning, team reflexivity, boundary crossing, and error communication. So task learning, as straightforward as it is, you're learning new tasks in the design process from your team. Team reflexivity is reflecting as a team on your processes and the task, how effective you were. Boundary crossing is the willingness to go, or the process of reaching outside your team for information. So if you're working in architecture practice, will team A ask team B questions? Perhaps team B has an experience, but they're not involved directly in the project. So will staff members of team A still be willing to go and ask them for help? And then error communication. How willing is the team with sharing errors that they've made or mistakes that they spotted? Will they just keep quiet and pretend nobody sees it? Or will they just shout out in celebration and say, I found a mistake, let's all fix it now? And then finally, the last part about team performance, which is looking at team effectiveness, employee satisfaction, and client satisfaction. So in terms of the research context, as I said, did the survey in 2019. So based on those statistics, there was 1,046 firms, architecture firms in Victoria, Australia. Sent out the link to the survey. Unsurprisingly, 868 did not respond. 178 responded, which was great, but only 105 was actually completed. So there was people who just did not complete. So I managed to get about 10% of the architecture firms in Victoria. In terms of this sample size of 105 respondents, the participants, 75 of them were registered architects and directors of practices. And then 31 were simply registered architects, not directors of any firms. And then the demographics of the participants as well. Most 30 out of the 105 were two team members. So basically a partnership arrangement in the firm. 45 respondents, which was the majority of the respondents, were working in 3 to 4 team members. 22 was working in 5 to 6. 2 worked from 7 to 10, and 6 was working with more than 10 members in a team. So in terms of the questionnaire outcomes, as I mentioned, I was looking at measuring how their processes of sharing co-construction conflict, constructive conflict, So that's the team learning behaviors. And I was also trying to measure their facilitating of team learning behaviors in the architecture practice. And finally, the team performance itself. So it was offered as, or the survey was issued as a Likert scale. So I gave a few statements where I asked the survey respondents to agree or disagree based on how familiar or how often they demonstrate those processes in the practice. So after that, with all these 11 constructs, I did a correlation analysis to make sure that they all matched. For statisticians out there or those who love statistics, this might be familiar to you. And then after that, I was also looking at team effectiveness, employee satisfaction, and client satisfaction to see whether there's any direct relationships with the team learning behaviors from construct 1 to 8. So I did a multivariate regression analysis just to see any just to spot out any significant relationships between these constructs. So these are quite, I would say, overly detailed questionnaire findings, but just to sum it up and to make it clear or help everyone understand, I was measuring team learning behaviors, facilitating team learning behaviors in the architecture practice, and whether they have any relationships, significant relationships with the team's performance. From that questionnaire itself, error communications, unsurprisingly, really high. It is the highest significant relationship with team effectiveness. Meaning if the team communicates their errors openly, the team is actually quite effective. And then second down was boundary crossing and reflexivity on task. What that means being, if the team was reflecting on their task regularly, it actually improved the team effectiveness. And if the staff members were given tasks to find information outside their teams, they actually had slightly higher satisfaction working in the team. And then finally, with task reflexivity as well, so reflecting on the work processes that they do every week, it actually also contributed to employee satisfaction and even error communication as well. So of all the team learning behaviors, sharing, co-construction, constructive conflict, task learning, team reflexivity, boundary crossing, and error communication, the last three, which is about reflecting, boundary crossing, and error communication, had some significant relationships or some significant influence on the performance of the team. Unfortunately, I think because I didn't manage to get clients' input, I couldn't actually determine clear relationships between the team learning behaviors and client satisfaction. So that's something that I still need to work on in the future research. So aside from that survey itself, the questionnaires also did an interview insights, conducted interviews. And I won't go into much details because this was, the findings was not as unexpected. So in terms of team reflexivity, so reflecting on task, practices do two types. It can be project specific and it can be practice specific. So things like when they meet with the team to identify effective and problematic tasks regarding a project, that's reflecting as a team. Or if they do it every weekly or fortnightly just to reflect back on all their processes, that's considered a team reflecting process. When it comes to boundary crossing, there's certain practices that invites consultants like lighting designers to participate in initial design process. So specifically for a project, other practices invite them just to present their workflow occasionally to the design team. And then when it comes to error communication, for project specific, there were practices that were assigning overlapping design areas in the project tasks. And I think this is quite a common process or arrangement that architecture practice do to make sure that mistakes are spotted before they get issued out. Or it could also be team leaders checking the works that's produced by the team just to point out errors by annotating solutions on drawings. So that was my findings from the survey itself. And I'm just moving on to research 2, making sure that I am still good for time. Yep. So the second part of the research and intervention one was to guide team reflections in architectural teams. And the intention was to use workshop methods to improve their performance. So the challenge and this was working with an architectural firm, the director himself, speaking to him on what's the challenges he sees in architecture practice and within his practice as well. It's always seeing that employees are wasting time doing the wrong things because they don't communicate with each other. And it frustrates team leaders because works get delayed, but it also frustrates team members because efforts gets wasted. And the early conclusion was that if my employees communicated better, they will perform better. So in terms of helping them doing applied research to improve their performance, this particular intervention started with a questionnaire. we ran a workshop and 1 hour online workshop during COVID, and also did some observations. So weekly and fortnightly reflections with the teams. And when it came to the questionnaire, I was building on the research from study 2. So using the team learning behaviors and team performance questionnaire that was issued out, and I sent it to them. And when it comes to the workshop design itself, I've used 5 exercises, which is the sailboat, 5 whys, process and cultural ideation, action priority matrix, and action canvases to help them try to unpack those challenges and to find ideas and potential solutions to help them communicate better. So a bit more about the project context itself. There was the participants were actually in Sydney, and there were 16 staff members in this Sydney architecture firms, 2 directors, 1 senior associate, 3 associates, 4 architects, 4 architectural assistants, 1 account manager, and 1 interior designer. How they operate usually is split up into 3 teams. So team 1 has 7 participants assigned with 1 director. Team 2 is the other half, and team 3 tends to bounce between team A and B. So with these 3 teams, in terms of the research context of when it was conducted itself, it was between August and November of 2020. So on the 17th of August, was measuring the participants' team learning's behaviors before the workshop. So trying to establish a baseline of how well or how much of the processes I just mentioned earlier on they do at work. We conducted the intervention, which is the workshop, on Thursday. Participated, or actually just stood in and listened to the team's reflections weekly, and then after that fortnightly as well, and then asking them to do the team learning behaviors questionnaires again in order to compare the pre and post intervention results, and then use the workshop and questionnaire data to describe the changes. So when it comes to the workshop outcomes, this was the sailboat exercise, and not surprisingly, one of the biggest findings, or not findings, I would say, one of the biggest points that we've all picked out was that staff should ask more questions. Because if just reminding everyone that the original challenge that the director thought was, if my employees communicated better, there would be less errors itself. So there was, yes, a big number of staff members thought that everybody needs to ask more questions. But what was slightly odd is that there's also people who were voting that staff should give more information. So it's kind of a talking about the same problem, but from 2 different sides. One is asking for more information, whereas the other group was asking that they should give information itself. And I just want to pause for a moment to mention that, and this is for team leaders and architectural directors who might be listening in on YouTube or right now, is that giving staff members access to information is not the same as giving staff guided information. By sharing with your Dropbox or Google Drive with the staff members doesn't mean that the staff actually knew where is the information that they need. So here, staff should give more information. What they are highlighting is they need to be guided through the information itself. Trying to unpack those challenges that they faced in practice. Some of them, some of the staff members were saying that perhaps other people were not thinking deep enough. But there's also issues that were mostly time constraints, and I think most of us understands that challenge, the lack of time, being able to go through information carefully. But there's also other unpacking of the challenge where staff members said that they were actually nervous about how questions are received. And this was slightly interesting because just before this presentation, I was looking at my readings or new readings itself. And there's one topic which I like to follow, which is about psychological safety. And Amy Edmondson, who was one of the the 4 founding mom of psychological safety. One of the articles she said was that it actually was more beneficial to stay silent than to ask a question. Because when you're asking a question, it benefits the team and it benefits the organization, but it may not benefit the individual. Whereas staying silent, the individual benefits because they are not judged at all. So I thought that was a really interesting article, which I will look into deeper after this as well. But talking about sharing, talking about asking questions, it may not be beneficial for the individual or for the staff members to voice out a question. So asking them to ideate, and this is about process and culture, ideating on how to foster a good working environment such that everybody feels safe to ask questions. Key ones were accepting everyone's levels of experience and also being inquisitive about the project itself. So here, what this particular process is trying to help the team members do is making sure that whether you're a senior director or a junior assistant, everybody's trying to establish a common baseline of expectations, of understanding in work practices. And the last two things that we did during the workshop was kind of using an action priority matrix to vote and find out which of these ideas that you like to work on first, because they came up with lots of great ideas. But what, as most of us are time poor in architecture practice. So they wanted to just focus on the top two or the top ones that will bring the most impact with the least amount of effort. And that was about accepting people's lack of experience. And then going through the team action canvas itself. So how do you turn that accepting people's lack of experience into something tangible that they can keep in mind something that they can keep in mind when they are working, such that they actually do accept people's lack of experience. So one of the thoughts were treating meetings as a learning opportunity. And learning opportunity here, it's on both parties. So senior directors learn from the junior members learn from the senior staff members as well. So the meeting is not just about passing information from one person to the other or reprimanding individuals when errors are made. It's about learning from both sides. And this will help to mold all the personal experiences into a collective one, because by discussing as a whole firm, or as in those three teams, everyone's clear on what to expect from each other. So when it came to the questionnaire outcomes, as I mentioned, I was looking at the team learning behaviors, fostering team learning behaviors and their team performance, using the Likert scale to measure team A, B, and C's. And these were the constructs that I was measuring it. Team A, B, and C. This was the before the workshop and before the weekly and fortnightly team reflections. And these was the after results. So there were some changes. Some of them were positive, some were negative. And I'll just pick a few to explain a little bit more. So when it came to sharing, so one of the team changes in the pre-workshop for team A, so these were the three statements I was asking the staff members to rank or vote on, or not vote on, sorry, to measure on. So when it comes to sharing, if something was unclear, we asked each other questions about it, whether I share all relevant ideas and information I have with my team, and we listen carefully to each other. So asking them to measure, to put on a point system whether they agree or disagree to those statements when it comes to sharing construct. So I just want to point out from the director itself, which was quite interesting because the director for team A actually disagreed that the team was actually asking each other questions. But when you look at the rest of the team, all of them actually agreed. They somewhat agree, strongly agree, neutral. So it was only the director's perspective that the director believed the team was not sharing with each other. And then after the post-workshop with the team reflections and the workshops, trying to establish a common expectations itself, the director scored the two parts slightly differently, almost opposite to somewhat agree now. When it came to a second change, it's about error communication. So overall, all three teams improved in their error communication after the 6 months. So again, just picking up from team A, slight improvement overall. And one of the reasons why I would say it's only slight is because 6 months was, 6 months was actually really short to do the study with them. And when they actually started out, they're already pretty good in their performance. So it's quite unlikely to see significant improvements after that. The third change from team B, as well with the error communications, slightly improved. And so did team C, even though there were only a small group of people. After the workshops, there was slight improvement through their error communication processes. So in terms of the next steps on how do I'm looking to push this research about architecture practice forward, is trying to analyze more architecture firms' team learning behaviors in order to see more significant correlations and to also build on that client satisfaction. It would be great if I managed to do research on architecture teams with their clients to measure the whole project and see how things perform or how they perform. And then continuing to help architecture teams improve their team learning behaviors using the workshop. So if there is a slightly dysfunctional team, it'd be great to be able to work with them just to see how well this particular workshop will help them guide them towards something, a more positive working environment. But aside from that, also just continuing on with what I do with architecture practices, which is the research, developments, writings, and communication. And just to end it off, the whole PhD over the 3 years itself, I really want to acknowledge my supervisors. So that's Jane Burry, Eva, and Anita from Swinburne University for guiding me through the whole process, online and in person. It must have been so tough during that transition itself. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Linus. Very impressive. I particularly love the exercises that you use, the action priority matrix, the 5 whys, the sailboat exercise, and the process and culture ideation. Are they tools that you get to use a lot in your current role at Design Factory?
Yep, exactly. And I actually learned it from the Design Factory. So those are just small little tools that I've picked up from their toolbox.
Well, they seem really interesting. Maybe I'll have another talk to you about them offline. I'd love to try a couple of those out. Are there any questions? Rebecca.
I have so many. Linus, that was fascinating. Thank you. I'm just like, obviously there's a bit of bias, right? And that the people that are self-selected to be in your study already have an interest in this. And so I guess my question is, what were your observation methods? Because you said you did observation, but then you said there were feedback sessions. So were you in the office watching those interactions, or were they reporting back to you afterwards?
So I was observing the Zoom because the workshop was online. So seeing who was actually communicating most, whether there was a particular person speaking most of the time, reflecting most of the time, and whether there were people who just was there to be there as well. Some staff members was just not, and like was not interested. It was just, I don't know why I'm here. You can see from the look.
Because I guess my question was, I've recently been reading Dana Cuff's Architecture Story Practice, which is like decades old now, but she sat in architecture practices and watched how everyone interacted as her method. And I think there's a whole bunch of, I suspect, hierarchies and things that would play out if you got to be closer to that process that are informing how it's actually happening. And for me, that would be the next step of your study, like one, to see how it's really happening, because I feel like everyone will tell you that they do creative conflict because it sounds like a really good thing to say, but then whether or not it actually happens in practice. So yeah, that was my first thought. But then the other one is the value proposition, because obviously this works really well in the context of the competition. But in terms of trying to get practices to implement it more broadly, like at that sort of director level, I guess I'm thinking, what are the tangible or perhaps even monetary outcomes of trying to implement some of these processes for practice? Because that would be a really interesting thing to understand. It was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, talking about the competition, that was the case study that I tried to do. But the thing is with the case study, because it's only selective teams, like it was actually a close competition. And I was trying to find out whether, were the jury members actually selecting design proposals or design teams? And from what I gathered, they were just selecting teams, especially if the project or the competition is for a build project. Some of the interviewees were saying that, yeah, most likely the design will be redone after the selecting of the winner. And what they were actually really curious about was how well the teams worked to present, or was it just one person presenting the whole time? Because to that, it indicates potential risk of teams falling out during the design process itself. So that actually came to influence their decision making at the end. Yeah, but it was just on one competition. I wasn't able to look at other competitions as well. So it's that's the next step for the particular case study. Yeah.
That's because you only did your PhD in 3 years. If you did it in a few more years like the rest of us, you might have got a couple more. Linus, I was just wanting to know a little bit more about how we can achieve better psychological safety within our teams. I know that's an area you're quite interested in. So I was just wondering if you could explain that some more.
Yeah, so psychological safety, as I mentioned briefly just now, Amy Edmondson did the initial research and have been pioneering that a lot. It's the ability, it's whether you feel safe as an individual to share your thoughts openly with your teams. And we can't force people to feel safe. We can't just say, all right, now's the time, ask all your questions, you won't be judged. That doesn't really work at all. And it has to show, what's the term? It's a both give and take. So if you're working in an architecture team and you're a senior staff member, you need to also demonstrate that you're open to being wrong, such that they understand that this is a safe environment to share their honest thoughts early as well. And yeah, I think the other interesting bit about the silence was the article that I still need to go and dig out and read a lot more about. Was really interesting because they were saying that if as a newcomer let's say a newcomer, an architectural assistant or a graduate architect enters the architecture team, it benefits them to stay silent, because that's where they don't demonstrate their lack of knowledge. They don't demonstrate their inexperience as well. So at that moment itself, even though the team leaders may be saying asking questions will benefit the team and benefit the design and the project, help everyone forward, it doesn't read that way to the individual. The immediate benefit for the individual is to stay silent. So that again goes with the psychological safety, and it takes time to get a person to feel safe to share. And it does require the culture and processes of the firm, and in the environment as well, where the team leaders demonstrate that. I know speaking to some of the architects during the interviews, they were saying, yeah, they try to things like social events, trying to meet the person in a different setting. It's also useful as well to get people to be more open to sharing. And I'm still looking at trying to find out all the different ways to help establish that psychological safety, because it was like I was reading about that and then COVID hit and everyone went online, and it's just totally new. And now that half people are in, half people are going back to the workplace and offices, it's now we're working in a hybrid arrangement. It again requires a new set of conditions and conditions and processes to facilitate and provide that psychological safety to everyone, however they are working. So long story short, still need to find out more.
Thanks, Linus. Rob has a question.
Well, first of all, Linus, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm not a designer, I'm just a psychologist. And so one of the things about these sessions is I get to see amazingly beautiful presentations. So thank you for that. But to come to another question, I'm wondering whether you think architectural practices and their group dynamics are worse than other kinds of organizations. I mean, that's a bit of an unfair question to ask, but I'm thinking about the kinds of literature you might also look at in your further research.
Yep, I totally agree. And that's something that I realized after the PhD, while trying to write it all up. It's like, this is such an interesting area, because for those architects in the room, what is an error in design? Aside from making an software error, how do you know whether design is a mistake or an error? A different perspective, different experience will argue otherwise. So especially when I was doing this research, I was always curious about what does error communication actually breaks apart into for architecture practice, because talking different perspectives may be an error communication to one, but may not be for another. So that was another interesting area that if I have the time to look at, I will look at after this.
Rob, just on that, you might be interested to know that there's actually there's a big research project going on at the moment about architectural well-being in architectural practices and architectural education. It's an ARC funded project through Monash University and some Sydney universities as well, and the architecture board and various institutions. So it's a really big project looking at architectural practice culture, and there are some really interesting findings coming out about generally lower than average well-being in architectural practices compared to the average population. So that may go some way to answering your question.
Thanks, Michaela. That's really interesting to know. Not that I've got it in for architects. Okay, thank you very much for the point.
Any other questions? Did you have another one, Rebecca?
Oh, I was just going to put in the chat. I think you could argue that the professions of law and medicine are pretty cutthroat. So I think those questions of comparing the architecture profession to the average population might not always be the things we should maybe be looking at. But Tamsin, I think, has her hand up.
Oh, Tamsin.
Yes, thank you. Hello.
Hi.
That was such a fascinating PhD topic area. I've worked in architecture since 2004, and my area of specialty is that people and leadership. So I just think it's marvelous that you went into that space. I do have a question around the issues that were coming up. Some of the areas you touched on were slightly transactional around information sharing and information giving. And I just wondered whether it had roamed into the presentation of ideas, because architecture really is about rationalising both. On one hand, you're dealing with facts, and on the other hand, you're ideating. So was there a balance between the two, or is that another whole area to delve into?
That's another whole area itself, because I think at the end of the workshop, and this was end of 2020 during COVID, my next thought was like, so how do we, and this is based off conversations with peers, with architects, there is a lot of things that's lost from working from home. The whole serendipitous conversations, the ability to just tilt your head to the next person's computer. It's like, how do you do this step? How do you do that step? That's all gone when you're working from home office or just working remotely. So I was trying to do another research project, which is about vicarious learning. So how do you learn through just being together from one another? But yeah, that's still trying to write that project proposal and find some fundings to get that project up and running. But yes, that was the next part as well. It's just fascinating because I think with architecture practice, you really need to sit next to the director, see him sketch on a piece of paper to really appreciate and understand the way he designs, or she.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Just a quick one. I think if you were to position that vicarious learning against the COVID scenario, that might be the key to getting funding. In terms of once we identify what we're losing, like, you know, then we can start to find solutions for it.
Yep. And that was one of the feedbacks when I actually applied for a grant for that. I was trying to develop through the grant itself, a vicarious learning canvas, so that senior members, junior members have this canvas, or like this A3 page of prompting questions that they can work through separately, but still get to learn from each other. But yeah, that was the reviewer's comment was, need something a bit more tangible. So I was like, okay, I'll work on that for round 2.
Are there any more questions or comments? Not missing anyone's hand up. Great to see you, Tamsin. Great you could finally make it. Okay, well, we might end the session. Thank you very, very much, Linus, for your presentation. Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Linus. Bye.
Bye.